Hi, I'm Ellen from The Chilly Dog. Welcome to my studio and our second annual Knitting Summer School. I'm stepping away from my regular knitting tutorials for a few weeks so that I can speak more broadly about a variety of different knitting topics. This year for summer school, I invited my newsletter subscribers to submit their knitting questions and concerns. The responses I received primarily fell into 3 categories: projects, process, and fit and finish. Today's topic is projects. Before I begin, I just want to give you a quick reminder that the best way to support the ongoing production of the knitting videos you watch and love here on our YouTube channel is by visiting the shop section of thechillydog.com and purchasing a pattern. While you're there, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter as well. Another great way to support our videos is by telling your knitting friends about the Chilly Dog. If you love learning with us, so will they. Now, let's get started. Our first question today comes from Kathleen, and she asked, how can I get motivated to finish projects without starting new ones? I think this is a really great question because it's a challenge that a lot of knitters face. We want to knit all the projects all at once, but there's only so many hours in the day. And if we have too many things on our knitting needles at any given time, a whole lot of them are going to end up in our unfinished objects pile, and nobody wants that. So, what I recommend is choose how many projects you want to be working on at a time and set something that's reasonable, maybe 3 to 5 projects at a time. Stick to it. Do not go over that limit, and it's hard. Now, you can group those 3 to 5 projects in a variety of different ways. If you're the type of person that needs to see progress and you need to be finishing things to be motivated to keep going, choose your projects that you're working on by how long they're going to take to finish. Maybe have 1 or 2 quick knit projects that you can finish really fast. Have a medium length project like socks that's going to take a little bit more time, but that you can work on here and there. And then have a long-term project like a sweater or a blanket. You'll be able to see that you're finishing things when you finish up those quick knits, and you'll still be able to make progress on the longer-term big projects. If you're concerned about having healthy hands and neck and shoulders and back, one option for you could be to choose your projects that you're working on by yarn weight. Maybe have 1 lightweight or sock weight project going at the same time as a DK or light worsted weight project, at the same time as a bulky or worsted weight project. That way, depending on how you're feeling and how your hands and body are feeling, you can choose the appropriate project to make yourself physically feel good. And one way to group your projects that I know a lot of my friends do is to group them by your location of where you'll be when you knit. So they'll have 1 or 2 portable projects that they can knit in the car or on the go. They may have a project that they keep next to the TV that's kind of a mindless knit that they can work on while they're watching stuff. And then maybe a project that is a porch or study knitting where you're going to need a little bit more concentration to work on it. Again, choose which one's best for you, and it may change. Sometimes you may choose projects one way and another time a different way, and that's okay. Do what's best for you. Our next question comes from, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Cleta K. I have a number of patterns that give the yardage requirements only in skeins of a particular yarn. How can I determine the correct weight and amount of yarn for these patterns as some of the products are no longer available? That's a challenge, but it's something that you can do. First, you're going to need to do a little bit of detective work to get the details about the original yarn that was used in the pattern. Now, hopefully all the information you need is actually written in the pattern, but it may not be, and you may need to do a browser search to see if you can find the yarn online, or look for information on Ravelry, or another great resource is yarnsub.com. And what you want to look for is the fiber content of the original yarn, if possible the yarn weight of whether it's a fingering or DK or worsted or bulky or whatever, the length of yarn that was originally recommended per skein, and the mass per skein. Then you can choose an appropriate substitute with that information that you have. And the best way, or maybe not the best way, but the easiest way certainly, is to choose a replacement yarn that has a similar fiber content and is a similar yarn weight. And it's also helpful if the yarn that you choose to substitute has a similar ratio of length to mass. So however many yards are in a skein compared to how many ounces or grams are in the skein. And if you have a tough time figuring that out on your own, again, yarnsub.com is a really great resource that can help you choose a substitution yarn. So if you choose a yarn that's similar to the original one that was discontinued, you'll probably need a similar amount. So make sure that you also get an extra skein just in case, you know, things are a little bit off, and so that you have enough to do swatching. Our next question comes from Darcy. She writes, I've been knitting dishcloths for about 6 months. My first foray into knitting. What should I do next? Visit an LYS and buy some real yarn? Dare I tackle a sweater? Before I answer Darcy's question about projects, let's talk for just a minute about real yarn. Whether you buy your yarn from a chain store or you're able to support a small business in your community by going to a local yarn shop, or you support a small indie dyer by purchasing yarn at a fiber festival, or you buy online from a business, it's all real yarn. You just need to be aware that different yarns have different characteristics and properties. The fiber content of yarn and how the yarn is processed from start to finish can have a great effect on the different characteristics and properties of a yarn. It can affect the launderability. Can your yarn go in the washer and dryer, or do you need to hand wash it, or do you have to lay it flat to dry it? It can affect the thermal properties. It can affect the moisture absorbency or resistance, flammability, durability, and of course, it's going to affect the environmental impact and price. These are all things to consider when you're choosing what yarns you are going to use in a project. The challenge is becoming an educated consumer and creator to figure out what properties and characteristics of your yarn are going to work best for the project that you're making. In my opinion, since I put a lot of time and care into hand knitting an item, I think it's important to buy the best quality yarn that's suited for your project requirements. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to buy the most expensive yarn. Different yarns have different purposes. For example, Darcy's chain store cotton that she's using for her dishcloths works very well for dishcloths. However, it wouldn't work well for, let's say, a pair of hand knit socks or a hand knit sweater. On the flip side, if I were making a hand knit sweater and maybe I chose a wool or a wool blend, it may work great for my sweater, but it would not work very well at all for Darcy's dishcloths. So you just have to take your time and think about what is going to work best for your project and your needs and that fits within your budget. So now on to Darcy's question about what project to tackle next. Darcy, think about this. Whether you have been knitting for 6 months or 6 years or 6 decades, you're always going to be learning something. So while a sweater project might teach you a lot of different things, that's okay. If you're in the mood for a project where you're going to learn all kinds of new stuff, and that a project that's going to take a little bit of time, that's fine. There are going to be times in your knitting career life that you'll also want just those comfort projects where you don't have to challenge yourself and learn new things. So my recommendation would be to pick a project that you're interested in. If you're in the mood to learn a whole lot of new stuff, go ahead, tackle that sweater. If you need a little bit more comfort knitting still, that's okay too. And choose your project that maybe you won't be learning as many new skills right off the bat. Either way is fine. Pick something you're interested in and it will keep you motivated to finish the project. Our last question today comes from Helen. How do I choose a sweater pattern that will fit well? I'm going to talk a little bit more about fit and finish in the final summer school lesson, but this is a great jumping off point that we can start thinking about that as we're choosing projects. I think one of the most important things to getting a good fit in a sweater is to know your body and be honest about it. First of all, you're going to need to know your measurements, and the pattern will tell you what measurements you need to take. You're usually going to need to know your chest and your waist and an arm length and a back to waist length and maybe a variety of other measurements. Take those measurements, accept those measurements, and choose the size that you make based on those measurements, not some arbitrary size number or designation like small, medium, and large. Next, you need to understand the shape and proportionality of your body, because not all styles are flattering to all bodies. It's, in my mind, more about proportionality than it is about size. So I'll use myself as an example. I have a fairly flat chest. It's really not much different around than my waist. I have an average to maybe even shorter than average torso length. And I have relatively long arms and legs. It's just the way my body is. So when I am choosing sweaters for my body, for example, I avoid shorter cropped styles because that particular style calls out that my torso is kind of short. It makes my arms look proportionally even longer related to the rest of my body, and it makes my chest look even flatter. I also avoid cap sleeves because the shorter sleeve length makes my arms look really, really long proportionally. And I'm also very careful with rounded yoke shaping because oftentimes I find that the yokes are shaped over a much longer distance than I necessarily need. Sometimes that can be adjusted for. Sometimes if you're doing some sort of color work pattern or stitch pattern, it doesn't work out so nicely and the yoke ends up being way, way too long, and it just doesn't look right on my body. If you're having a tough time knowing what sort of styles look flattering on you and that you feel comfortable in, the first thing I would recommend doing is checking your closet. See what clothes you have in your closet that are the styles and shapes that look good and feel good on your body. Then you can choose patterns that are styled and shaped in a similar way. Another way to have success with the fit of a sweater is to make sure that when you are picking patterns, that they are designed by reputable professional designers and not just something that was written down by somebody. When you get patterns that are written by professional designers, they're going to be edited for accuracy, making them easier to follow and understand. They're also usually going to include some sort of schematic and maybe multiple schematics, which makes it easier if you need to make any adjustments based on your own proportions or dimensions or whatever. If you have the schematic in front of you, it's a lot easier to know where to make those adjustments. And a professionally designed pattern is going to be graded to accommodate a greater number of sizes. As I said earlier, whenever you knit a project, choose the best quality materials that you can afford and that hold true to your values and have the characteristics and properties that you need for your particular project. And finally, and not everyone's going to like this, but it's very, very true, swatch, 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 swatch. Know how the fabric is going to behave so you know how it will work for the sweater that you're making. So I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and until we stitch again, happy knitting.